Good morning. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me for the second time that I'm here. I was in Lisbon last year, and it was a pleasure. And I wanted to make sure that I was present in this one as well. Congrats also to Marco and Ewan and EASO to keep on this and also the leaders of the NIU summer school, which seems to be a success. And please return to Lisbon and to Portugal as often as you feel like it, if that helps getting the attention of your young investigators. I feel like saying now for something completely different. But as I say that, I also was reflecting on how a group such as yourselves, and I'm going to ask you where you come from in a minute, would deal cognitively and in your reflections about obesity with talks from such different levels of the study of obesity. I was paying attention to the conversation, the discussion just before, as we were talking about the nutrition considerations and then the environment, and now the discussions about the causes of obesity. And it's hard not to think of just asking about the causes of obesity is a very tricky question because is it the environment? If you think of population level, there's no doubt about that. If in a particular individual, of course, you have to look at other mechanisms why that person is more prone or less prone. So saying that 100% of obesity is caused by a biological condition it's just half of the answer, because we live in an environment where our biological and psychological proneness will manifest itself in very variable ways. So my first point is very important to distinguish the levels in which we are interested in exploring the topics, so then we can reflect on the questions and the answers that provides to ultimately help solve the problem of obesity. It's very easy to get confused, especially when you're a young researcher, as you ask questions, well, how will this talk that we just heard will help solve the problem of obesity? Well, that's not the goal of this research, to solve the problem of obesity. Anna might disagree with me, but that's my strong conviction. At the same side, if you look at someone researching or thinking about the environment or population levels of obesity, if you ask them, well, how are you considering brain mechanisms regulating appetite? The question doesn't make sense. It's a whole different level. It doesn't mean that the levels are not all of them important and that all of them will make a contribution, but it's important to keep them distinct to some extent. So my first question is, where do you come from? And I'll put you in three categories. Basic research, basic mechanisms, mostly biological mechanisms such as those, or often with animal models such as the ones we just heard. What I would call behavior change research in individuals, looking at patients, interventions with real people, trying to change behavior and see the mechanisms involved in those processes, and perhaps people interested in your research or in your interest in population level obesity, environmental interventions, public health interventions, things like that. So the first level, basic mechanisms. How many of you are primarily focused on that? I thought there would be more by the type of questions before. The middle level, so behavior change mechanisms working with patients, clients, and interventions, small-scale interventions, okay? And population level interventions. And some of you may raise your hand more than once. Yes. Okay, so it's actually more spread than I thought. I thought you were leaning a bit more towards the first level. So my talk is situated on the second level. I'm interested in knowing how a single person changes behavior or a small group of people change behavior. And you can ask me, well, how will, for instance, talking about motivation will change population levels of obesity? Well, maybe at the end you can have your own opinion, but my answer will be, well, partially. It's definitely not the solution to the problem of obesity, which doesn't mean that as we think of broad-scale solutions, we shouldn't take some of these considerations in mind. But that's not my main focus. I'm not trying to solve the problem of obesity with the types of research that you'll see described here. Again, important to keep these differences in mind, otherwise we get confused and we ask the wrong questions and we get confusing answers as well. Okay. Forgot my chrono. So, same as Anna, I have a small research group in Lisbon looking at the types of topics that I've just described. And one of those researchers is sitting right here, Inês, who's in the group. And we've been focusing on interventions, focusing on lifestyle change, with a particular focus on motivational mechanisms. And I'll cover that a little bit more towards the end of my talk. But my goal today was to give you a bird's eye view on the research and the key research topics in this area. So I'll fly through a lot of slides. I just want to give you an idea of what the hot topics are, some of the things that are being researched now. I cannot go into depth in most of them in 30 minutes, but I want you to hear about them, and then if you feel like exploring, at least you have a starting point. I'll also give the slides with the references so you can explore on your own. But it's really going to be a bird's eye view, and I tend to speak fast and go through slides also fast. I've stopped wanting to change that. It seems to be in my genes somewhere, so you're warned. I said this slower. I hope it's not too confusing. Perhaps too many topics, but just to give an overview I'll talk briefly about the role of theory, show you some theories and some classical perspectives. I'll talk a little bit about theories of motivation, and then I'll show you some empirical findings so you have some support for some of the assumptions, and you can explore them further, and some future directions. And I'll focus on obesity and the related behaviors, mostly physical activity and diet. So theory. A book that just came out recently showed that there's at least 83 theories of health behavior change, or could be applied to health behavior change. It's a complex area, and it's an area where many questions that people want, when you want to use theory, they come up. This book helps at least show you what's there and the key constructs in each theory and how might they relate to each other, and it helps clarify, even though it paints a complex picture. I'll try to simplify a little bit for you on the role of theory, but first, it's important that we consider that theory is important as we build interventions, again, on that middle level to change behavior at the small group scale. Some of these ideas may also apply to broader interventions, as I'll show some examples of later today. So theory specifies the constructs, the typically psychological constructs that regulate people's behavior to some extent, the relationships between them, and the explanations for how those constructs might relate to change. So it links behavior change to certain variables in a consistent or systematic way. So it helps investigators to understand how and why interventions work, and most importantly, sometimes why they do not work. It's very often that you see an intervention that doesn't work, and you are helpless to realize why that was the case, because you didn't identify the key constructs that you wanted to change that then would change behavior. So it allows for testing interventions, but also to test theory. And so today it is agreed by all of us, it should be agreed by all of us, that considering theory is important as you design behavior change interventions. There's also ways to classify or to assess whether an intervention is properly influenced by theory, or theory was used in a correct way. And there are some guidelines that you can follow, and you can look at papers and see how much or how little theory was used, or better, how well or how less well, if I may say so, theory was used in a particular study. And this is the reference for the theory coding scheme if you want to use that. Now, if you don't want to follow a particular theory, if your interest is broader and or you are unsure about which theory makes more sense in your context, there's also broader frameworks that you can follow that are not specific to any single theory, but are broad enough that they encompass most of the determinants that most theories contain. And so this is one of those overarching frameworks which you may have heard about, the Kombi system, which basically says that determinants of behavior should follow one of those three categories: capability, motivation, and opportunity. And you can, I think, understand what those terms mean. And for instance, if you're doing research that is very ingrained in changing a particular aspect of the environment, you're probably talking about the opportunities for behavior change. If you're looking into, for instance, diseased patients which might have a hard time following certain guidelines, for instance, for physical activity, perhaps determinants related to capability might be more important. And for many interventions, motivational issues show up in one way or another. So just to give you a broad framework to follow, which is, it's not atheoretical, it's trans-theoretical or at a different level of theory. So you've probably heard of a lot of these theories. It's not important, just to give you an overview of some of the ones that are most cited. I'm not going to go into detail into any of those, perhaps with the exception of the latter one, which is the one that I've been using a bit more. But self-regulation theories and motivational theories are being researched at a high extent as we speak, and I'll give you some insights on those. There's also questions about whether we should remove some theories because they've been proved wrong or proved non-useful, and you can follow those discussions. Are very interesting discussions for those of you interested in more theoretical issues in behavior change, why perhaps we have too many theories and some of them may be redundant or have not sustained the test of time. They've been proved less useful. Self-regulation in general, or self-regulation theory, as you may say, the term you may use, is a popular topic today. It's a very broad umbrella term to encompass most of the behavioral mechanisms associated with change in health behaviors, and it's a popular term. There's labs looking at self-regulation. This is one in the Netherlands. This is one in Australia. Our own group also has that name in its designation right now. And I'll just give you an example of how self-regulation has been conceived of, as most often been interpreted as, which is this idea of self-control, that people, that one of the things that might distinguish people that are more successful or less successful in changing behavior is this idea of willpower or self-control, which in more technical terms translates to things you may have heard of, such as the ability to delay gratification, self-regulatory strength. This is considered a strength model of self-regulation, and this idea that of ego depletion, which you may have heard of before, that if you, basically the concept is that if you strain this reservoir of strength, of willpower, consistently, for instance, as you restrain food intake willfully for a long time, for a certain period of time, you will lose this capacity. And with time, or you will lose the capacity to continue to flex this willpower muscle, and then you will disinhibit, and you will lose control. This was the idea that became very popular in the field of health behavior change, and it's now losing its popularity. And one of the reasons is that is a registry replication report. I don't know if you've heard of a registry replication report before, but it's a very interesting type of research where you select a certain experiment that you think is a good model for the type of assumption. In this case, the assumption is ego depletion is a key process in behavioral regulation. You select a particular experiment and you ask a large number of independent labs to replicate that same experiment. It's sort of a meta-analysis of one particular study, and you see what the results are. It's hard to have better evidence than this for a particular mechanism. And this was done actually by authors that have published papers before, which support papers and reviews that supported this ego depletion mechanism, and for their surprise, the results were close to zero. So they were not different than zero, and so this provoked a lot of discussion, a lot of even sadness among researchers. There's a lot of things online that you can follow which are interesting about this notion that the effects of ego depletion on self-regulation were not as strong as they thought. Actually, they were non-existent. There was a conclusion for this registered replication report. It's a very interesting model to answer scientific questions. There's other perspectives that I'll just go quickly over, also encompassed within the area of self-regulation, but some of them are called post-motivational because they are considered to be, once you are motivated or somewhat motivated, what type of processes are in place that distinguish successful and unsuccessful individuals in changing behavior. And some of the topics that you'll see that I think are more promising, that are being more supported by the literature, and that and so you are likely to see more research on, are things like things around goals in general. Setting goals, goal setting, goal facilitation, goal conflict are very hot topics these days, and it's something that I think you will see more of because obviously we all deal with multiple goals at the same time, but many of our experiments don't take that in consideration. If the goal is losing weight, often you don't consider in your experiments other types of goals that are also important, that are conflicting with this goal of, for instance, being more physically active. This seems very simple in concept, but actually researchers have not taken multiple goals in consideration as they design their interventions. So that's one of the topics. The topic of habit is also an interesting one. When do you establish a habit, and is that a predictor of sustained behavior? What are the predictors of habitual behavior? Is also another area that you may want to pay attention to. You have some references here. Also, things like action planning and coping planning. So making coping plans or making action plans for behavior change. And usually this has to do with contingencies, if-then contingencies. If this happens, what do you do? If that occurs, what's your response, and if you plan that into interventions and then find out whether that makes a difference in people's behavior change and sustained behavior change. Implementation intentions, it's basically the same thing, where you have an intention regarding a particular form of behavior change, a particular form of implementing a change. For instance, if it's raining, what do you do for your exercise and things like that. Very applied. You could call them self-regulation skills when you're already motivated. Now, I think that the issue in behavior change at the level that I'm speaking about is really the issue of maintenance. I think that's probably agreed upon all of us. It's much easier to change behavior than to maintain that change behavior, and obesity is a perfect example of that. And you see a lot of trials, even the questions before that Tommy Vischer was asking about why virtually no intervention has found sustained behavior change on average. There's also some recovery. So it's important to dig into the issues of maintenance. It's a very nice review that looked into theoretical explanations present in health behavior change theories that have looked at the issue of maintenance, or how do you explain maintenance from this perspective. And it's a very recent review, and they've identified 5 themes: motives, self-regulation, resources of all sorts, habit, and environmental and social influences. So around these topics, or these are the topics that come up as theories try to explain how humans maintain behavior changes. And I've talked about a couple of them, and I will now focus a bit more on the issue of motives, which is the one, or motivation more broadly, which is one that I've been pursuing for some time, and to give you some, some additional food for thought for considering motivational issues as you think of health behavior change in obesity in particular. I'll follow a particular perspective, and I didn't have to show you this, but I'd rather tell you the theory that we've been using to understand motivation. There's different reasons why we use this theory. Maybe it makes sense for you at the end of the talk, but that's not important. I could have followed a different perspective, but I think this is one of the perspectives, theoretical perspectives, that goes more in depth into human motivation from both a quantitative but also a qualitative view of why we do the things we do. So it's not, according to this theory, it's not so much about how motivated are you to do something, but what are the underlying reasons, and what's the type, what's the nature of those reasons, because those different reasons might hold different prediction power towards behavior change in the long run. It's one of the few theories, I think, that makes explicit predictions about integration of behavior into one's lives. And most theories are more focused on behavior change and initial adoption. I think this theory speaks well to the issue of when people do make changes that last a lifetime or that stay for long, what are the mechanisms that are in place in those times? This is not important. This is just to give you a sense of how popular the theory is, but it's also not very important. I did a little search in 2015 or last year to see where did it sit within other theories. So it's popular enough. It's been researched, and that's the only point I wanted to make. Also, in the psychological literature, it's actually one of the most popular theories in terms of physical activity. It's been more used in that particular area. It was also the topic of an opening debate at the Society of Behavioral Medicine a couple of years ago, where they wanted to discuss behavioral economics against motivation as key issues in health behavior change. And this was an interesting debate, to say the least. So key concepts that help you think about using this particular perspective in thinking about behavior change and one's motivation. And this actually applies to health behavior change, but it applies to all types of behavior change. Sorry. So I've been speaking to my... Anyway, the key point that I want you to keep in mind is, as I've said, there are qualitatively different types of motives for us to do the things that we do. You've all heard about intrinsic motivation. You know what that is. It comes from within. It comes from things that you are really interested in. It even may be fun to do. Easy to describe. But then there are other types of motivation that are not perhaps so natural for you, things that you wouldn't do if there was no reward to do it, but that are still important for you to try to achieve. And health might be one of them. Being with people that you value might be another one. So that there are different reasons why we do the things we do. And the major distinction that this theory puts forth is this distinction between more internal and more external forms of motives. And they are technically named more autonomous forms of motivation and more controlled forms of motivation. Let me explain you what that is. So more autonomous forms of motivation. It typically are things that you strongly endorse, that you identify with, that you describe them as being personally important to you. And you might look at signs when this motivation are present. And the overlying signal that you may look for in yourself or in patients are things around choicefulness, around the sense of freedom of making a certain decision. Losing weight, it's a perfect example. How many people, even without their awareness, start to lose weight for reasons that might feel pressured, as opposed to feeling fully volitional. This is something that I'm now doing for myself, as opposed to this is something that my doctor told me I need to do, or my wife or husband is pressuring me to do, or that I feel that my peers are pressuring me to complete or to engage in, versus feeling that it's a fully reflective and a decision that reflects who you are and what you value. Things around there, just to give you a sense of where this, what more autonomous motivation feels and looks like. And you may think of actions such as attending this course, or making a certain decision in your life, or taking a job, or something like that, and situate those decisions in this continuum, from more internal to more external, as opposed to more external or heteronomous controlled forms of motivation, where the underlying sense is a sense of pressure. And this is the key feature that one should look for as we try to analyze where the motivation is coming from. The pressure might usually come somewhere from the outside, from our environment, the pressure to eat in a certain way, for instance. But sometimes we also internalize pressures, such as the desire to be thin because one has endorsed this ideal, this thin ideal that society values, and has become part of what I value now. I value being thin, even though I know that being thin is not associated with other things that are important to me, but it became an issue for me, and I feel this pressure to lose weight, or to be active these days, or to be fit, or to look young, and you can expand this to other things such as how to be socially accepted, or to be rich or powerful, things like that. Yet, I must do this, I ought to do this, I feel like I must do it. That's the underlying idea behind it. Some people have called it motivation as opposed to motivation. It's a good way to remember it. So the key idea here is these two forms of motivational, very broadly described here, have different outcomes. They have different implications, both behaviorally and also in terms of one's well-being. And behavioral is what we are mostly focused here, because I'm talking about maintenance of behavior, and I'll show you some research briefly, but the underlying hypothesis that we are testing is that whether this form of motivation is predictive of longer-term adherence to health behaviors. Consistent behavioral pursuit, and also engagement. The way in which we are participating in activities is also important. Sometimes we are there, but we're not engaged. Sometimes we are saying yes to my nutritionist that's saying, you should do this or that. Sure, I should do it, but it's not, I'm not fully engaged. I don't go home and learn myself, and learn or by myself about the types of activities that I'm being suggested to do. And what you see is that the engagement is more superficial, is more inconsistent, and sometimes it's only dependent on the external contingency. So as long as my such and such keeps pressuring me to do so, I will do it, or so long as I'm paid. Financial incentives are a big thing in health behavior change these days. So, and research is very clear. As long as you're being paid, things are changing. At the moment you stop being paid, you stop doing the behavior. That's very clear these days. And that was one of the topics of the debate that I showed you before. Totally different, and this is for those interested in more basic research, but there are now correlates, neurophysiological correlates of different types of motivation, which is very interesting. So is this psychological or is this behavioral? It doesn't really matter. Of course, everything is biological ultimately, but you can then assess and change sort of phenotypical and behavioral characteristics of those traits. I'll go over this. So let me give you a brief summary of some of the research that is exploring some of these hypotheses that I've showed before. Regarding weight control, there's a source that we've worked on a couple of years ago that looked at the research at that point that was focused on weight control from the perspective of self-determination theory of autonomous motivation. And these are some of the papers that at the time we covered in the review, but there's also a conceptual review that expands on some of the ideas that I'm summarizing here of why would motivation be important for weight loss. And we went into different topics around the issues of goals, goals that we established, the issue of persistence, also the issue from the perspective of the health professional, because they have their own motivation too. Sometimes they have their own pressures, and that influences on their patients. So a lot of topics around this that you may want to explore. Briefly, results from the longest RCT that has been published that used this perspective to try to change behavior in obese, in this case, overweight and obese women. I'll just show you that. So we based the intervention on self-determination theory. No time to explain that here, but you can follow it on some of the papers. And these are the results that we got on average. So yes, the intervention group recovered weight. On average, results were on a level that you might consider interesting from a public health perspective at least, if not from a smaller group perspective. This also brings the question that I raised earlier. Small changes in the population are very, very meaningful. Small changes in an individual might not mean anything. And so just to come back to my initial point that the way you evaluate certain outcomes is very different depending on the perspective that you're taking, looking into it. We also looked at mediators of those effects, and that's another topic that that I think is very important when you are conducting research. As I've said before, especially theory-related researches, whether the key mechanisms are explaining some of the variance in the outcomes, and you can test those looking at mediation effects. Oops, pode-me ajudar aí atrás a voltar ao só por o modo de projeção. Obrigado. So this is a paper where we tested some of those mechanisms through looking at autonomous motivation to be physically active in overweight women and to the extent to which those predicted physical activity and weight change 3 years down the road. I think this is the only study looking at such long-term outcomes. But there are others. For instance, this is a post-hoc analysis, but also looked at prospective associations between motivation and weight control that you may want to look at that supported this idea that autonomous motivation and also the extent to which people feel supported in their autonomous motivation makes a difference in the long run. EASO has just published a paper very recently looking at a broad sample. This is a cross-sectional sample of looking at prospective associations, a broad sample of underprivileged Australian women, and looking at intrinsic motivation for physical activity, or intrinsic motivation and physical activity levels in the context of weight loss attempts or not. So and again, some supportive evidence for this role of intrinsic motivation in this case, in physical activity. And there's also a systematic review looking at the types of motivation and physical activity outcomes, so behavioral outcomes. Most of the research still cross-sectional, but there's more and more experimental research being done, showing essentially that the more internal the motives are, the better the outcomes in terms of behavioral adherence. If you're really into objective data for physical activity, there's also some research that used objective data for looking at physical activity and the same type of predictors. Eating behavior, there's growing, still small but growing research looking at not physical activity but eating behaviors in the context of the same type of predictors. So the extent to which you feel your reasons to eat in a certain way are more internal or are more pressured, and how that relates to outcomes, to BMI or to eating behavior in the long run. This is an interesting study from New Zealand that looked at some associations for BMI, for healthy eating, and for also the types of eating patterns that you display based on the type of motivation that you report. And we also published a very interesting paper in Health Psychology a number of years ago where we looked at the same predictors for eating self-regulation. So the question here was whether motivation for physical activity spilled over to motivation for eating in the course of obesity treatment, an obesity lifestyle change intervention. And this is one of our most cited papers because it's very interesting how being motivated in one area can potentially influence how you're motivated to other areas. And you know how that feels when you go for a run and then you sit at the table in the next hour. You might feel differently about what you're about to eat, but also in a broader sense, the reasons that, for instance, in the context of weight loss, the reasons that underlie your physical activity might be the same reasons, or the same type of reasons that underlie your eating behavior. And we want to be congruent as individuals. We want to be consistent across our acts. And so it makes sense that motivation in one area spills over or relates to motivation in other areas. And in obesity, that's very important because, of course, it's a multi-behavior condition. It's just a meta-analysis, not important. Some other findings from a project, Spotlight project, where we looked at different types of factors related to obesity. My particular role of my group was to look at individual level self-regulation determinants, and we published a review here too, looking at different types of predictors. And if I wanted to, and actually mediators, we're looking for mediators or findings consistent with mediation. And if I just have one slide to show to you, to tell you which factors I think are most important in behavior change lifestyle interventions, these are probably the ones that I would ask you not to forget about, to include as you design an intervention. Self-regulatory skills, I've talked about briefly about it, quality of motivation, self-efficacy or your confidence to change a certain behavior, body image, and the level of flexibility or rigidity that you display in your eating patterns. And these are probably also interrelated, as we discuss in the paper. So this is the best evidence that we have right now of factors at the level that I'm speaking about, the behavior change level, that might have an impact on the outcomes of your intervention, or the intervention with a patient, with a client, or a small-scale intervention looking at behavior change in obesity. These are predictors of weight loss in experimental trials only. A few developments. So there are more interventions being conducted today in different types of interventions. Many of them are digital interventions where the principles of what I've just described are being implemented, are being embedded into the intervention, which raises my first point or addresses my first point, whether some of these principles can be scalable, can be thought about or considered at broader scale interventions. And digital health interventions are ones that are being adopted for their mass reach, their low cost and high level or high reach. And we are involved in several projects where we are using the same principles that I've just described, which apply to individuals at a broader level, as we, for instance, design an application tool that is meant to be used by thousands of people. Another development, and you may have heard of behavior change techniques and the effort to systematize the types of techniques that clinicians and practitioners use in daily practice. It's very important, especially for research, that those are described and reported consistently so we can accumulate evidence in the best way. And what we are doing, as you might expect, is looking at self-determination theory and seeing what are the techniques there that are most critical. So we gathered a group of experts, and we are trying to isolate the key components of a practitioner intervention that will affect the key constructs of that theory. And we have now a list, after several stages, we have now a list of 24 motivation and behavior change techniques. We changed the topic slightly. By the way, Susan Miki, which is the author of the original ones, or the main investigator, is also involved with us. So this is not in opposition. It's a single theory perspective, whether she has a multiple theory perspective or trans-theoretical perspective even. And just to give an idea, this is the list for autonomy supportive techniques, but there's others for competency and another one for relatedness, which are some of the key constructs of self-determination theory. Just to give you an idea of the type of things that are being conducted now that might help, in this case, design interventions that want to target certain variables. Also, theory, and it doesn't matter if it was STT or some other theory, has been used in very large-scale interventions, such as smokefree.gov, which was a text-based intervention that used sound theoretical principles to design text messages, if you can think of that. So if you write a text message to someone to promote or to support a certain behavior, there are different ways in which you can write those. And those can have underlying theoretical principles that are very different. And so that was the goal of this particular public health intervention that used theoretical principles to design the text messages in the US. We're also using the same principles in two other trials. One of them is the Eurofit trial, which is an FP7 EU-supported project, which is influencing football fans, soccer fans, for those of you from the US. So football fans that are related to clubs in very connected ways, and football is very popular these days, if you heard the news last night. So we're looking at in particular, so we're using some of the best teams in Europe which adhere to the project, and that we are trying to change the behavior of their fans through the club to adopt more healthier lifestyles. And again, using some of the same theoretical principles. This is ongoing. I don't have any results. We just finished the intervention, so we are starting to collect some data. And at a very different level, but we are also, this is more focused to the topic here, we're also designing a digital toolkit, an application basically, or a web app that will presumably help individuals that have lost weight to sustain their weight losses in the long run, again, following theoretical principles and looking at mediators, but we are designing applications. So we are designing an app such as the ones that you have on your iPhone or smartphone, and trying to make it consistent with with theory, but also with the way in which research can be reported and evaluated as being theory reliant or theory compatible. Okay, that was my talk. I have time for some questions, I hope. And thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, can you give us a little bit more of granularity in terms of the soccer assay? What is exactly how do you implement? What is exactly the project? The soccer one, the soccer.
Yeah.
So how do you get a hold of people? What do you ask them? How do you collect the data? And then what do you do to the data?
So briefly, the clubs. The clubs did a lot of the work in recruiting. There's lots of fans, as you know, in these 3 major clubs, and all of the fans want to be in the club's facilities and dress the jersey and be there, so it wasn't hard to recruit. What we announced was a lifestyle change for men. I forgot to say that it's just for men, which are inactive, and the main goal of the intervention is improving physical activity. Yes, maybe I'm not answering.
So you go to the stadium and you ask a person, what is exactly that you ask the fan? I know that people can go to the stadium, that's given, but then exactly how do you recruit people?
So an email was sent to supporters of the club through the club,
okay,
saying there's a study going on. Would you like to be part of that study? The goal is to improve your physical activity, and the club will help you do it. That's basically the recruiting method.
All right. And they believe
they
that.
didn't have to be overweight, although many of them were. They had to be physically inactive because this particular trial was not focused on obesity, although the previous trial that inspired it was more focused on obesity. It's called Football Fans in Training from Scotland. This one is focused more on physical activity and sedentary behavior. And what we do is a 12-week intervention weekly. They go to the clubs. They are trained by club trainers, so people that are already working in the club, usually football youth coaches that learn some of the principles that this intervention is about, and then they teach the classes themselves. So it's a very externally valid. The goal is that this could be then implemented in other settings, perhaps in other sports, and so we don't do a lot. It's very ecologically friendly or ecological in
okay, so the soccer fan goes to their favorite club to be trained by a professional. Does that profession has to be paid by the FP7 funds, or how do you get this to work?
Yes, they were paid.
By the grant?
By the grant, yeah. By the university, by the grant through the university.
I see, okay.
Although, I mean, in this case, we had to pay them for study reasons. But the goal is that this type of programs can then occur on their own through resources that the clubs themselves generate. And this is being this is getting a lot of attention from other countries and other sports in Australia, in the US, in Germany, I believe, other countries and other sports even. Australian rules in Australia. There's some colleagues, some researchers that are wanting to replicate some of this model in other areas. The idea here behind it is, again, looking at an affiliation that already exists between a person and a club, which are very strong, and for men or for clients or participants to, through that association, feel more motivated to initially start and then go through the intervention.
How do you collect the data?
As you normally do, so they come to club facilities. We do everything in the club, and through technicians from the university, we gather physical activity data. They work accelerometers. They are measured there. There's also some blood analysis going on for some health outcomes that are being evaluated. So regular visits. In this case, it's not in the lab; it's in the clubs. Although some visits might occur in the lab. These are very.
So you measure blood pressure. You do no blood tests, I guess, because it's in the gym.
We do some bloods. We collect some bloods. They are being analyzed for
at the gym.
Not at the gym, at the club facilities.
At the club facility.
At the club facilities. So they have
which
their
is
own,
a workout gym, right?
No, well, not for collecting blood.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to picture.
So we established with the club facilities, especially for the blood. They have reserved rooms where nurses are setting up the stage.
Okay.
Yeah, in the club. So the clubs were very invested in this because they wanted to have sort of a social role that went beyond just promoting entertainment and sports, and this is also for them a way to show that they care about the health of their fans.
So the clubs, they also contribute with money and sweat, or?
No. Everything is paid for them. Okay. Although in the future, if they want to have such a program, they may have to generate.
Because when the grant runs out, it's the end of it, right?
Well, this is a research study. There's some questions that we are trying to find.
Yeah, your goal is to collect data, I see.
So hopefully, if it works, then it makes sense. If it doesn't work, we don't want it replicated. This is a research study. I think Jeroen had a question.
I think there was a question here first.
Oh,
yeah, and then Jeroen certainly also has time for his question.
I just have a question.
We can talk more, and then I can talk all the time.
Regarding the spillover theory, what about the opposite? Those who do exercise and and they want to treat themselves or think they deserve treat or that dessert or.
Yeah, there is a known mechanism. So we need to understand what the mechanism is there. Maybe a motivational mechanism, or maybe a different type of mechanism, a cognitive mechanism in which you... the question that I would ask is why you're exercising in the first place. Because oftentimes what's going on there is the reason for exercise is that they can be more, or people can be a bit more loose in their diet. There's nothing wrong with that in principle. Actually, I think that's a very interesting way to balancing your energy input and energy output. As you think of exercise, for instance, looking at the other way around, in a week in which you cannot exercise, such as when you travel, you may change your eating habits. So there's possibility to go both ways. But it is known that to the extent that people exercise so that they can eat, that could be a risk factor for weight gain in itself. So again, it goes back to what's the reason for exercising? Is it a broader goal, or is it just a simple goal of enjoying food? Anyway, I'll stop.
Questions from my side then.
Yeah.
Of course, in order to design the most optimal interventions, we need the data, we need the research. When you showed the slide and the data about motivation, autonomous versus controlled motivation. Yeah. And controlled motivation, if I recall well, had neutral effects or even negative effects.
Sometimes.
So. How cautious should we be in interpretation of the data? Do we overestimate the beneficial effects of interventions? Because usually I think the more motivated people will apply and take part in several studies that we design, right? Am I clear enough? So
maybe
because I think if I understood well, the more motivated people had autonomous motivated people had the best outcomes.
Yeah.
So also in the different interventions, for example, the football club interventions, the motivated people will agree to participate in the study and maybe have the optimal results.
So two questions there. One is, are we getting the most motivated people to begin with, which then can affect the external validity of the study, which I think is your underlying point. Yes, in many studies that is the case. However, through this particular perspective, we can somewhat adjust for it, because the interest here is not so how much people are motivated, but what is motivating them. What is motivating them? So to that extent, you always have in a certain sample people that are more internally versus more externally motivated, and you can play with those baseline data, try to improve the most adaptive form of motivation through the intervention, and then analyze results as such. But your question is very important in the broader sense, that many interventions may be affected by the initial level of motivation that people already have when they join a program. So it actually highlights, interestingly, the interesting bit or the reason why one should look at motivation both quantitatively and qualitatively, which addresses the main point.
Okay, thank you.